I'd like to start today by talking a little bit about where we are. Of course, we're at Goodwill, and it's, I think, a really appropriate place for us to have some of these discussions, and thanks very much to them. But more important, we're in London, Middlesex, and it sits at a very important crossroads in terms of the history of Ontario and Canada. It's been the home to peoples for many millennia, many thousands and thousands of years. And as president of the Ontario Museum of Archaeology, I learned a lot about trade and economic activities, the years and thousands of years of families and communities that have existed on the banks of the Thames in this very, very same area. All before European newcomers, which were my descendants, I'm a descendant of, came to this country. During the Truth and Reconciliation process, British Columbia First Nations brought a tradition to the commission and said to Sinclair, Justice Sinclair, said, you know, whenever we come to someone's land that isn't ours, we thank them very much and we acknowledge that it isn't ours and that we're visitors. And that's where the tradition of the land acknowledgement came from BC First Nations through the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And so that's where we have taken our cue today. It's particularly fitting to recognize this because we're in a period right now where we're really trying to sort out truth. And we have to sort out that truth in order to find any kind of basis for reconciliation. And building on that truth and building on the goodwill, we will find reconciliation between our peoples, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, newcomers and descendants of the distant past. The Attawandaran people used to be the peoples that occupied this area of the Thames. They were called the Neutrals. And now the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lenape, and including, of course, their communities, the Chippewa of the Thames First Nation, the United Nation of the Thames, and the Munsee Delaware Nation. Given we're speaking of health today, we're speaking of everyone's health. Those people who are struggling, those people who can give. It's a day when we can reflect on the responsibility and acknowledge that we want to reach out to all the peoples in our region. And we want to acknowledge the Indigenous peoples who have stewarded these lands and worked to build their communities for thousands of years. We respectively give this acknowledgement as allies in the work to improve the lives and health of all peoples in the region. Before we get started, one thing I really want to do is I want to thank Deloitte. They are our Vital Signs sponsor, and we appreciate the ongoing support they have given us. It's so important. I'm sure we could all talk about that, but it's so important what they've been able to do to help us with this important initiative. We also want to thank our friends at webisod.es who are here recording tonight's event. Thank you, thank you, thank you. You'll be able to share now with many people, and we really appreciate it. So let's get rolling. I'd now like to welcome Luis Patricio from the London Poverty Research Centre at King's. And Luis is going to talk a little bit about the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. I'm saying a little bit, not because he doesn't know so much about this, but we could talk for days about this initiative. The Poverty Research Centre has been doing work on localizing the indicators for the SDGs, and I'll tell you, London Community Foundation is a very proud partner in this important process. So please, Luis, take over.
Thanks, Jerry, for the warm introduction, and thanks for always inviting us for those vital conversations. I have like you said, it's a very short, so I have a short cheat sheet of what I want to share about the SDGs, and it just want to bring this from the global level to the local level, as the vital signs are based on the SDGs, and the SDGs are those 17 sustainable development goals 106 targets and 232 indicators that were created but put forth by the United Nations. And they stem from the Millennium Development Goals that were targeting developing countries. From 2000 to 2015, and now from 2015 to 2030, it's the Sustainable Development Goals targeting all countries around the world. In a way, they are still addressing all developing countries, because if you think about sustainability, there's not one single country in the world that is entirely sustainable. So they're really addressing our countries. They're still in their developing stages. The vision from the United Nations with the SDGs is really to address, as you can see in the table, poverty, health, inequality, clean energy, climate action, and many other things. This is an international push from many different countries, and here in Canada we can see, well, we have the vital signs. This is not just an initiative from the London Community Foundation, it's really a national strategy from all community foundations, and we're proud to know that the London Community Foundation is one of the groups that are heading this initiative in our country. But even the federal government, they established data portal hub with Stat Canada and federal funds to support this work around the country, and a national strategy to implement those goals. And sometimes we stop and ask ourselves, but why those global goals? Why those international issues and federal issues? Why do we spend so much time talking about them here in our city? Because local matters, and even the people who created the framework, they recognize that around 70–80%, most of the work is really done at the local level, at the ground level, because we are the people who have the expertise. We are the peoples who have this expertise and have those connections to have those authentic conversations, and sometimes those difficult conversations that we need to have to create systemic change. There's so many things that, so many challenges that we are addressing today, and they include social, economic, and environmental. And the main takeaway from that framework is to understand, and it's one of the core messages of the SDGs, is to understand that integration. And just this morning we're with a group, and some of you folks were with that group, trying to spread and raise awareness about this integration. We're talking about the 4 aspects of that integration, and this is the last thing I want to say, is to share about those 4 aspects. So the first one is this cross-sector collaboration. It's a language that is being used by the social sector, and the Community Foundation is a leader on that sense, using the vital signs to share the SDG language. It's shared by the business sector, and now the B Corp certification is embedding the SDG Action Manager, so businesses who want to not only make a profit but also look at the social side, they can use the SDGs, and also governments in the form of the voluntary local reviews. The second integration is the interscholar integration. Like I said, it's international, it's national, but the local aspect of it really matters. The third integration, which is the 17 goals and the triple bottom line, the social, economic, and environmental. It was just, we have such an amazing group of speakers, and I'm just talking to one of them, Sarah, and she was sharing about how important it is socially, the work that they're doing, but also how big is the economic and the environmental impact. So this is, I think, this is the kind of language, this is the message that we need to get out there, is to really understand that we don't have to choose about creating a sustainable ecological future and just give up our economic development. We don't need to address our social problems and think they're gonna be poorer because of that. It's really, we can address those things all together. And the last one, it's one of the core messages within the SDG framework, is leave no one behind. So it's one of the questions that we should always ask ourselves: who is not on the table, who needs to be here, what voices need to be heard. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Luis. We're going to get started with our speaker series, and I'll tell you, I am excited today. I get excited, but today I'm really excited. I embarrass my kids most of the time, and grandkids, and a grandchild. So, here we go. I'd like to welcome our four speakers this evening. Dr. Javeed Sukhera is Associate Professor of Psychiatry for the Schulich School of Medicine and Dentistry, and a scientist at the Center for Education and Research and Innovation. Robbie McLaughlin and RN, and Robyn Hodgson, RN, trans health nurses from London InterCommunity Health Centre. Blair Henry, harm reduction case manager for regional HIV/AIDS, and Sarah Askew, founder and owner of Mensadora Rebel Rags. So I'd like to introduce our first speaker. Javeed, will you take the podium, please?
Good evening, everyone. Thanks so much for coming out to this very important event. I am honored to be invited to speak, and I want to thank the organizers for inviting me. And I want to share with you a little bit about my story. So I truly believe that I have the best job in the world. When people ask me what I do, I tell them that I get to cultivate hope, particularly among young people who are struggling and who feel like they want to give up. But why I actually chose to go to medical school was because I wanted to change the world. I saw the injustice, I saw the inequity around me, and I felt like connection was going to be what transforms things. I thrived on connection. But in the first few years of medical school, I felt completely disconnected. I was stuck in a very dark place, memorizing as much as I could, reading as many books as I could. And I felt like learning these facts would not make me a good person, good doctor. That I needed to see patients, I needed to work with people. So it was my third year of medical school where that magic happened, that I began to thrive. And I remember very distinctly that there was a patient of mine who was diagnosed with cancer in front of me and who deteriorated very quickly. So I spent a lot of time with her and her family, and she was very close to the end. And my professor said, you should really go visit her. She would welcome a chance to see you. But I also remember being paralyzed by fear. Fear that if I was to do that I would experience emotions that I wouldn't be able to regulate. So I talked to my friends and colleagues about this, and what they told me was, well, you just need to stop being so sensitive. You really need to grow a thicker skin. And those are the kinds of messages we receive, that we need to numb ourselves for self-protection, that we need to be less sensitive, that we need to protect ourselves by actually disconnecting ourselves from the things that make us human. But I took that advice, I worked hard, and I ended up here in London. And I ended up here on the front lines of a system that is extremely broken. And I realized that all my interests in global health and equity, that the biggest inequity was facing me every day when I saw the prejudicial and discriminatory way that my patients were treated in the system. Because as many of you know, in London, in Canada, we do not treat people who are struggling and suffering with mental health concerns and addiction the same way as we treat other people. And when people need help and compassion, they encounter a system where they experience blame and shame. So I witnessed this, and I tried to understand it better. And I looked at my colleagues, and I saw how they interacted with these patients. And I felt like I was watching a completely different person. These were all good people. They were people who I saw their humanity outside of work, but who I was watching was like a completely disconnected version of that human being. But what I witnessed made me realize that watching these people working in the system was actually like looking in a mirror at myself. Because in those early years, I was in a very dark place. I saw how broken the world is every day. And I was coping with that by doing what I was taught to do, which was disconnecting from who I really was. I spun my wheels as fast as I could. I burned my energy to try to fix things, to try to make things better. But what I was left with was an empty shell of a person. I wasn't the person that my family deserved. So there's consequences. There's consequences for this disconnection, for falling for what society tells us. And these consequences are for our own health and well-being. But they're even bigger than that. What happens when we're perpetually disconnected from ourselves and each other is that we see big problems around us, but then we fall into this trap of blame and shame, and we all do it. We try to fix everybody else, and we burn all our energy into these cycles of blame, shame, and disconnection. But my story didn't end there. Our story didn't end there. And that's because I want to ask you all, what are we so afraid of? Are we afraid that we're somehow not good enough, not smart enough, not worthy? What if we started to change the way we approach things? What if we took the revolutionary action of looking in the mirror at our flawed, imperfect human selves and actually had compassion for what we saw? Because self-compassion can actually be the key to all this. Not only can self-compassion help us be healthy, it can help us neutralize that fear, that inner critic, the cycles of self-blame that we fall into. But it can also help us address this disconnection that we see all around us, because it's getting worse. We're getting more and more disconnected from one another. But self-compassion can help bring us to a place where we can actually lean in to those difficult conversations with each other. We can have courageous conversations and begin to co-create the kind of change that we want to see. Because being human isn't something we should be afraid of. It's something we should celebrate, because it is this secret sauce that brings us together. So from my perspective, it really is a question of what it means to be healthy. And I would say that being healthy means being human. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much, and that was beautifully put, Javeed, so thank you very much, and thank you for inviting us here tonight.
I think we just want to say what he said, and there's nothing more to add. And thank you for so very eloquently displaying what we need in a broader context of communicating the needs of broader society, and then bringing us up as very isolated content experts within the trans community, which is really one of the silos within healthcare that we're experiencing. When I was preparing to stand up in front of you, I wanted to demonstrate, as an arbitrary number, London has a population of 384,000. Our mandate in our clinic is to look after London Middlesex, so a rough number, 425,000 people. Trans identities are about 0.6% of the population, which translates into about 2,500 trans people in the City of London. And so that's kind of the population we're working on servicing. Of that 2,500 people, it doesn't mean that that's going to be recognized from birth. These are identities that are demonstrated. We have folks that are coming to us and seeking assistance with living authentically in demonstrating their true selves in their 60s, in their youth. We have adolescents. And so it makes for a very dynamic group that we're working with. Robbie has been, and perhaps a little background about us. We are both registered nurses. I'm trans-identified myself. Robbie has been working with the local population for 5 years, and so this is an ever-expanding program. And Robbie can give you a little background on the program.
Yeah, so some context with our program at the London InterCommunity Health Centre, and also applying to sort of trans care on a larger scale. I reference the Trans Pulse survey fairly often when I'm working with clients, and it's currently being sort of revisited with Dr. Greta Bauer here in town. And so the Trans Pulse survey back in 2010, it pulled a lot of very good lived experience and information about the trans population in Ontario. And then London actually sort of took that upon themselves and had a trans health forum and gathered together stakeholders from the community. And our organization was identified from sort of the London Trans Health Forum as a player in the community when we were positioned that we could sort of rise to the table and sort of, so we engaged in a full day. Our whole organization underwent some training from Rainbow Health Ontario, where we were able to steal Robyn from this past year. And after we did an organizational training, we sort of opened up our doors and started creating our program. We didn't know what we were expecting at first, but we knew that there was a large amount of trans-identified folk outside of Toronto who were having a really hard time accessing care. And it really snowballed from there. We have about 350 clients on the program currently, including the wait list, and we've seen about 500 people in total, including people who've been discharged out for various reasons. So it's been quite a learning experience, and a neat thing that comes up, and when we're talking about pressing needs facing the community or sort of current health challenges, one of them is that we're kind of seen as sort of a specialty center or experts in trans health, and there's a big push on sort of the larger medical society and even internationally about depathologizing trans identities and working this into sort of like a general medical practice, supporting family physicians to caring for their clients, and not even in the medical society as well, helping society to create more welcoming, affirming, inclusive spaces. So the access to appropriate services and care, which we created, and now we're trying to help to share that with sort of the larger London community and also further out into Ontario, and to help increase sort of different appropriate care and affirming opportunities for trans clients.
We, in trying to present this to you, it's also trying to describe to you what might not be familiar, what a trans identity is. There's an organization, it's called WPATH, the World Professional Association of Transgender Health, and they have existed in many forms. They're currently on their number 7 ideation of their standards of care. And that recognizes that trans identities have existed throughout various cultures across the world since the beginning of time. And in that, we have come to expect a gender binary in North American or Western European societies, which is male and female. And this comes to recognize that that's not necessarily representative of how we are actually born. And people can be a little more one, a little more of the other, completely in between, or actually in some cases, neither at all. And so as we're trying to put everyone into our neat little boxes, when people come forward and say, I just don't fit there, how is it that we can assist them? And when we're looking at trans individuals, there's the medical aspects that Robbie's been referring to, and it's things like hormones and surgical interventions, but there is also such a huge component that's social. It's a matter of acceptance. As I started to read through the vital signs that came out in 2018, and we looked at some of the headlines, being sheltered. And what does that look like to a trans individual whose gender identity doesn't match their documentation? If we need to send them to a place of safety, whether it's the Mission or Women's Community Health, and their identity doesn't necessarily allow for them to enter into that protected space. It is what does their documentation look like? What does this community need. And it is assistance with not just the medical aspects, but the social aspects and the acceptance as well.
And a neat component as well, so me and Robyn have the opportunity of doing sort of presentations amongst our staff and sort of being called upon by various different community members or healthcare providers and giving almost like a Trans 101 or some tips or advice. And a lot of it boils down to being kind, respecting pronouns, and very similar to how Dr. Javeed was just saying about being human, allowing yourself to experience those emotions, validating someone else's experience. We were having some pretty interesting conversations at our table, and yeah, someone's experience of gender and their identity. We've all kind of noticed that at some points people are looking out for external validation or someone telling them how they identify, and just really creating those safe, inclusive spaces that people can feel comfortable to identify how they are, to explore that, and to just create those opportunities for people that they feel safe enough to do that. So that was kind of some of our takeaway pieces. We were wondering what we'd like to change and see happen would be creating a lot more of those spaces, not only in the medical community, but also at various other areas of the community as well.
We want to make sure we really thank London Community Foundation for facilitating this conversation. We know that there's going to be questions and answers moving on. We've got a sort of a perspective of where we're coming from, and then hopefully we can, with the other speakers, we can take the conversation forward later. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. My name is Blair Henry, and I am a case manager with the Regional HIV and AIDS Connection here on King Street. And I work specifically in something called CarePoint. And CarePoint, which you've no doubt read about and heard about, is what has been called a safe injection site, a supervised consumption facility, a consumption and treatment facility, a temporary overdose prevention site. We've had a bunch of different names. Currently, we are a consumption and treatment facility. And this is the place where people are going to come and safely be able to use substances. It's a controversial bit of work. It's controversial until we start to understand actually the impact that it has in the community and the actual work that we do. And I just want to take a few minutes to just take you into a typical client story, if I could, and just as an illustration of sort of the path that might lead to somebody actually utilizing our facility. I have one client and his story, and again, I have used a little bit of narrative authorship in this to protect people's identity, because we are an anonymous and confidential service, and we really, really respect that. And we have this one young fella, and I want you to imagine he was an immigrant, a child of immigrants, and he was at 12 years of age. He, as he described to me, watched his parents go through the front windshield of their car and, as he said, gurgle to death on the road. At that point, because he had no extended family, he was put into the foster system. Of the 3 homes that he was in over the next 6 years, 2 of them had sexually abusive males in the household. At age of 18, he broke a leg, and the doctor prescribed him OxyContins to help with the pain. At that point, he was able to deal with something in his head. I need you to understand that we all have seemingly unbearable thoughts in our mind that we need to manage, control, and avoid. And this individual had no way of dealing with those issues. And once he had his OxyContin, the opioid into his system, he said to me, I was able to close my eyes and not see my parents. I was able to close my eyes and not have an abuser chase me down the hall. I felt normal for the first time in my life. Well, his script ran out. And if you have that feeling of normality, if you have that, and that's all this person wanted, was just to feel normal. And he had a taste of that, And so he went out on the street to buy a substance illegally because his script had run out. And on his first buy, he was arrested and ended up into EMDC. This is the story of so many of the people who come into our site. And I'm going to tell you, I get emotional about this. I'm a leaky male, and I'm proud of it, because this is something, as we talk about connection and we talk about fear of being able to deal with our own emotions in these situations, it's a really important thing to recognize that people are suffering for reasons that we, as society, attach a narrative that is entirely fictional and imagined by ourselves. All of you have heard throughout your life that addiction and people who suffer from addiction are making bad moral choices. They're making all sorts of bad decisions, bad people. And I want to tell you that I get to spend the majority of my day with incredibly talented, incredibly beautiful humans who are struggling through often no fault of their own. If you've ended up in the consumption and treatment facility at CarePoint, it's very, very likely that you have an incredible history of trauma in your life, and that you don't have the tools to deal with that trauma on its own. And one of the things that we're able to do is to help people start to develop some new tools. And as those tools get developed, ways to deal with that emotion, to deal and process that trauma, we see that the need to use starts to decline, and we start to see people voluntarily, willingly stepping away from substance use. I personally do not know a single person from my high school who wrote in their high school yearbook that they wanted to live underneath a bridge and shoot drugs into their arms. That was not something any of us aspired to. And yet that ended up being my story pretty much. And that was something that I couldn't have imagined for myself. And this is something that we have to recognize, that these stories are not the imaginative narrative that society and media, your parents, all the significant others in your life have told you about them. We need to break these stories down and recognize that each one of us are very, very much looking to soothe our troubling emotions. We all have stress, anxiety, all sorts of things. Some of you might be looking forward to going out and getting home and having a glass of wine. Some of you might be going home and smoking a joint. Some of you might be going home and watching something on the internet, or sitting down and just having Netflix and creating a big, huge divot in your sofa from your butt sitting there every night. All of us have ways of soothing. And some of them are more socially acceptable than the ones our clients have found. But we're all doing it for the same reason. And very often the reason that you have to sit and watch Netflix is because you don't have someone to talk to. Somebody to help process stuff, to help you feel better. And the opposite of addiction is not sobriety. The opposite of addiction is connection. And that's what brings us together. And as Javeed has said, and as Robbie and Robyn have talked about, by being able to create safe spaces for people, by being able to actually check our imagined storylines that we've created about people who are sleeping on the streets, about the people who are increasingly populating the streets of our city right now. Those stories that we're imagining are not based in reality. The true story is that we've got humans who are trying their best. And we don't do, any of us, something over and over and over unless it has a payoff. All of us will do any sort of things. It can look from the outside, it can look like a negative behavior, but there is a payoff in there. For the individual I was talking to, the payoff was, I just wanted to feel normal. For me, I had anxiety, I had issues of trauma from my past, and every time I closed my eyes, it was, just that feeling. And when I had substances in my system, it just allowed me to go, ah. And that's what we want, is everybody just to be able to take a breath and relax and come into the present, come into the now without fear of judgment, and being able to ask for people for their help. And so when I see people like Javeed going and working with frontline people in hospitals so that they can actually check their innate bias that we all bring. Nobody's guilty in this situation. We're just victims of the stories and the reasoning, the faulty reasoning that people have told us. And once we find out and once people start to understand, oh, I'm imagining that may not be true. What I'm feeling, the storyline that society has told us all along may not be accurate, then that opens the door for connection. That allows us to sit down in front of somebody and say, how you doing? And I'll tell you, if we do that, we're gonna be on our way to making a much more livable city. I will tell you, 2 years ago when we opened the site, in February of 2018, I could walk from King Street and Clarence and Dundas down to InterCommunity Health Center, and I would meet maybe 50 or 60 people who were living rough, people who were homeless, and who had perhaps addictions challenges. And I would know every one of these people by name, and I knew their stories. In the few short years, in 2 years now, I can tell you I could walk that same distance and I'll meet 100 people and I might know 5 people by name. Our populations are increasing on the street. As social or economic disparity increases, we have less connection with people. We're getting bigger houses and fewer friends. We are becoming more and more isolated. And the solution to all of our society's problems isn't for us to get into our own bedrooms and living rooms and basements and cocoon, but rather to come together and talk like we are today. Thank you.
Well, thank you for having me, and it's hard going at the very end after so many great, amazing talks. But I'm Sarah Askew, and I am owner and founder of Mensadora. And we have a mission. Our mission is to end period poverty and personal hygiene poverty. We all know someone that every month doesn't know how they're going to get their needs met. Unfortunately, often those people are hidden, and they just find different ways to manage their needs. So it is a very hidden situation that happens with a lot of people. We began our mission about 4 years ago now in the jungles of Vietnam. We were working with female Buddhist monks actually, and they were going to all of these little towns and they were using reusables, and I had never experienced that before. And what was interesting is they were doing this because they didn't have access to garbage removal, so they would have to burn everything. They didn't have access to stores, and they wanted a way to ensure that their needs were always getting met. And then after we left Vietnam, we moved to the jungles of the Yucatan, and we lived in an off-grid eco-village. And again, we saw that reusables were being used because it was safer, more environmentally friendly, and everybody had them. We came back to Canada, we bought a school bus, and we took it across Canada to really see what people in Canada were doing. I was shocked. I'd never even realized how much period poverty was actually happening. For me, myself, I was in medical school at Western, and I was experiencing period poverty. I had to choose as a single mom between food for my son or to get my needs met, and my son was always fed. So I want you just to take a minute and think about that. Like, what would you do if you didn't have access to something you have no control over? In London alone, we have at least 30,000 documented cases of people experiencing period poverty every month. In Ontario, it's 1 million people experience period poverty every month. So what do people even do, right? And we did interviews when we first started, and we have grade 8 girls here in London that are using the same pad or tampon for 4 days. We interviewed people at Safe Space, and they are actually rinsing products out and reusing them. This is a huge medical concern, obviously, as well as where's the dignity? Every year, we have roughly around 200 disposable products get put into the landfill. Over the course of someone's cycle, that's 16,000 products. And that's a pretty low number based on some of our stats, but that's what the government believes we put into landfill. So that's an incredible amount of waste just in itself. Regular period pads are non-regulated. We don't know what's in them. They don't have to actually write down what the chemical component is, so we are seeing people having negative effects with them. Because periods are still such a tough taboo, a lot of our younger girls are going without anything, and what they're using are socks and rags or nothing. They're free-flowing. And obviously, this is causing an issue for them. They're not going to school, they're not able to go to work, they're not able to just do every daily activity that they would want to do. And this is in London. This is, within our community. The resources currently in London is the food bank. Unfortunately, they can only get a couple, enough for usually a day, depending on what is coming in and being available to them. London was the first city in Canada to become providing disposable products in local areas and schools. And that's a huge step. But unfortunately, what's happening is we're noticing resource guarding. So individuals are ensuring that their needs are met, so it's quickly depleting the stock. Or it's not getting out to the people that need it the most because of various reasons, including not being able to get to the location, or they just don't even know that it exists. Several organizations are also handing out disposables. But again, it doesn't meet everybody or every situation. So for us at Mensadora, we actually create a one-for-one program. For every pad we sell, we donate one to a local individual. Last year, we donated over 5,000 pads locally to individuals, but we can do better. We are working towards ensuring that nobody in London and eventually Canada-wide has to worry about where are their products coming from, because it's a dignity issue for us. We also have started to develop a product which is like reusable adult diapers or incontinent products, because this is also for our seniors as well. Again, people aren't getting their needs met, so how can we expect them to go out and have a job or go to school or just have those regular daily activities? As we've heard, our city is experiencing a high level of poverty and other issues. And if people can't get their basic needs met, it's hard for them to change their story, and it's hard for them to step into a different version of their life and become what they want to become. We believe that we all have a purpose, and the purpose is to serve humanity. You find what you love and you give it to the world. And that's what we do at our organization. And dignity is so important because if people can step into a better version, they can find out what their purpose is, and then they can give that freely. And then we can create this network of everyone helping and supporting others. I recently received a message from someone that we were able to provide a set of pads for. And there's something incredibly amazing to hear that every month she thinks of her pads and me. And that might sound crazy to you, but for her, she now can finish her schooling. And it was the most powerful message that what we are doing with our organization is the right path, because we're changing lives with something so simple. We talked about the UN's initiatives, and our products not only allow people to reduce waste, it allows them to improve their dignity, but it also, on a financial level, we're able to accommodate these clients of ours at the same price as you would pay for a year of disposables. So it's a no-brainer. It's a win-win situation. It's better for the environment, the body, and for the belief system that we can make a difference in everyone's lives. So the other thing too is I want to thank the London Community Foundation, because they're actually one of our biggest supporters and one of the biggest things we're grateful for. They believed in us when we were just starting out, and they were able to help us continue our mandate and continue our mission. And up to date right now, we're sitting at around 10,000 pads donated to local individuals here within the city. We are looking to expand our program, and we've actually expanded into St. Thomas and some of the surrounding areas, St. Mary's, because they're seeing a need for our products as well. Because the thing is that when someone's other notes are in here. Because one of our biggest challenges that we have is the fact that there's an ick factor with period pads, right? And even the shaming of periods. And I was talking to Jerry earlier about the fact that it's finally becoming a conversation. We're seeing this more and more, that it's an open discussion. But I always say to people, what did you think your grandmothers used? You know, what did you think all of these other countries are using? And it's a real solution to this problem. The other issue too is that we are a very disposable society. And if we can streamline and move people that have the ability to use washrooms and things like that, or that they have their own housing situations, we can move them to reusables, and we can focus on putting the disposable products to those that it meets a better needs, those experiencing homelessness, things like that, where a disposable setup is a better idea for them. And being healthy isn't just about what you put into your body, it's about how you view yourself and the world around you. And we support dignity by ensuring that people's needs are met. And when your needs are met, then you can go in and do amazing things. And we're really about reusable solutions and not disposable bandages, so that everyone can step into the truest version of their story.